The small boutique was warm and filled with the soft hum of a sewing machine. Manuela, a talented dressmaker in her late 50s, carefully adjusted the delicate lace on the wedding gown in front of her. Years of experience had given her a steady hand and an eye for perfection. She loved her work, especially when it came to wedding dresses. Each one held a story, a dream, a moment that would be remembered forever. But today that warmth was met with coldness. Across from her stood Isabella Montgomery, a young bride from a wealthy family. She was beautiful, with long, flowing blonde hair and sharp green eyes, but her beauty was overshadowed by the disdain in her voice. Her mother, Evelyn, stood beside her, offering little more than an approving nod as her daughter spoke. "This is unacceptable," Isabella scoffed, running her fingers over the intricate beading. "This looks cheap. Are you even capable of making a gown worthy of me?" Manuela flinched at the harsh words but remained calm. "Miss Montgomery, this is only the first fitting. Any changes you'd like?" "Changes?" Isabella interrupted with a laugh. "The whole thing needs to be redone. I told you I wanted something exquisite, something that would make people gasp when I walked down the aisle. Not this pathetic attempt." Her words cut deep, but Manuela refused to let them shake her. She had dealt with difficult clients before. "I assure you, Miss Montgomery, I can make the necessary adjustments." Isabella rolled her eyes. "Just do your job, and do it right this time." With that, she turned on her heel and walked out, her mother trailing behind her without a word. The little bell on the door jingled as they left, but the boutique suddenly felt much colder. Manuela sighed, looking down at the dress. She had spent weeks perfecting it, ensuring every stitch was flawless, but to Isabella, it was nothing. Shaking off the hurt, Manuela picked up her needle. She had a job to do. Little did Isabella know that her wedding day would be nothing like she imagined. In fact, it would become her worst nightmare. Days passed, and Manuela worked tirelessly on Isabella's gown, making every change the bride demanded. She replaced the beading with finer crystals, adjusted the lace, and ensured the train was longer, just as Isabella had requested. Every stitch carried her skill and patience, though deep inside, she couldn't forget the way Isabella had treated her. The final fitting arrived. Isabella walked into the boutique, her heels clicking against the wooden floor, her expression unreadable. She slipped into the dress and stood before the mirror. For the first time, she was silent. The gown was breathtaking. Every detail was perfect, from the shimmering bodice to the way the fabric flowed like water around her. Even Evelyn, her usually indifferent mother, gasped softly, but Isabella wasn't one to give praise easily. She examined herself with narrowed eyes, turning from side to side. "I suppose this will do," she finally muttered. Manuela gave a small nod, hiding any disappointment. "I'm glad you're satisfied." "Barely," Isabella replied. "It took far too many attempts to get it right." She turned to her mother. "Let's go. I have bigger things to worry about than a dressmaker." With that, she left, leaving behind only a lingering scent of expensive perfume. Manuela exhaled slowly, watching the door close behind her. "She didn't even say thank you," her assistant, Rosa, muttered. Manuela only smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Not everyone values what they are given," she said quietly, "but life has a way of teaching them." She carefully packed the gown into its protective cover, ensuring it would be perfect for Isabella's big day. But fate had its own plans. The grand Montgomery estate was alive with celebration. Guests in expensive gowns and tailored suits sipped champagne under twinkling lights. A full orchestra played in the background, their melodies weaving through the soft laughter and chatter of high society. Inside the bridal suite, Isabella stood before a gilded mirror as her bridesmaids fluttered around her, adjusting her veil and smoothing out the folds of her gown. Despite her usual air of superiority, there was an undeniable gleam in her eyes as she took in her reflection. Today was her moment, a day where she would be the center of everything, where everyone would marvel at her beauty. "Finally, something went right," she murmured, admiring the way the crystals caught the light. Her mother, Evan, stood by the window, watching the guests take their seats. "You should hurry, dear. The ceremony is about to start." Isabella smirked. "Let them wait. A grand entrance is only grand if people are dying to see you." Her bridesmaids giggled in agreement. With a final glance at herself, Isabella turned. "All right, let's go." She gracefully stepped out of the room, her gown trailing behind her. But as she walked down the grand hallway toward the garden, something strange happened. A tiny ripping sound. Isabella froze. She glanced over her shoulder. The fabric of her train had snagged slightly on the doorway, but nothing seemed amiss. With a dismissive shake of her head, she kept walking, yet with every step the sound grew louder. Rip, rip, rip. The bridesmaids exchanged nervous glances, but no one dared say a word. Then, as she reached the doors leading to the altar, it happened. A loud, unmistakable tear. And in front of hundreds of guests, Isabella's gown, the one she had insulted, belittled, and treated as beneath her, came apart. Gasps filled the air. And the nightmare had only just begun. Time seemed to slow as the sound of tearing fabric echoed through the garden. Isabella barely had a second to react before the worst happened. Her gown, the very symbol of her perfect wedding, unraveled before her eyes. The delicate stitches along the bodice gave way, the intricate lace at the seams split apart, and in an instant, what was once a masterpiece turned into a shredded mess hanging off her body. A horrified scream tore from her lips. Gasps and whispers rippled through the crowd. Some guests covered their mouths in shock, while others awkwardly looked away. A few, unable to help themselves, stifled laughter. "Oh my God," one of her bridesmaids whispered. Isabella stood frozen, her face drained of color. Her hands clutched desperately at the torn fabric, trying to hold together the remnants of her once glorious gown. The perfect moment she had dreamed of had just turned into a living nightmare. Her mother rushed forward, eyes wide with panic. "Isabella, we need to get you inside," she hissed, grabbing her by the arm. But Isabella wasn't listening. She was shaking with rage, her eyes scanning the stunned faces of the guests. Then, suddenly, her fury found a target. "The dressmaker," she spat, her voice venomous. "That woman did this. She ruined my wedding." Evelyn's face twisted in realization, and she turned to the wedding planner. "Find her. Get her here now." Within moments, 2 staff members rushed inside to locate Manuela, while Isabella, humiliated and seething, was quickly ushered back into the estate. But the damage was done. And what neither Isabella nor her mother knew was that this disaster was just the beginning. Because sometimes, the way you treat people comes back to you in ways you never expect. Inside the bridal suite, Isabella paced furiously, her ruined gown barely clinging to her body. Her bridesmaids hovered nervously, unsure of what to say. Evelyn stood stiffly by the door, her arms crossed tightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. Minutes later, the door swung open. Manuela stepped inside, her expression calm despite the tension in the air. She held herself with quiet dignity, her sharp eyes taking in the scene, the torn dress, the panic, the uncontrolled fury in Isabella's face. "You," Isabella hissed, stepping forward, fists clenched. "You did this. You sabotaged my wedding." Manuela didn't flinch. "I did no such thing." "Don't lie to me," Isabella shrieked. "The dress fell apart. You must have done something. Loosened the stitches, used weak thread. Something to humiliate me." Evelyn narrowed her eyes at the dressmaker. "We paid you handsomely. If this was some sort of revenge for my daughter's criticism, you'll regret it." Manuela sighed, looking at the gown with a practiced eye. She reached out, touching the torn seams lightly, then met Isabella's glare. "This wasn't sabotage, Miss Montgomery," she said evenly. "This happened because of you." Isabella recoiled. "Excuse me?" Manuela lifted a brow. "You demanded changes again and again. You insisted on thinner fabric for a more delicate look. You wanted a tighter fit, to make your figure stand out. And despite my warnings, you refused to listen." She turned the gown inside out slightly, revealing the seams. "Your dress was altered far beyond its original design. The delicate structure couldn't handle the stress. The moment you walked with too much force, it gave way." Silence filled the room. Isabella's lips parted, her face twisted in disbelief. "You're lying." Manuela remained unfazed. "I have the records of every alteration you demanded. I even warned your assistant seamstress that forcing the bodice too tight would strain the material." She paused. "But you dismissed every concern. You wanted what you wanted, no matter what." Evelyn's face darkened, but she said nothing. For the first time that day, Isabella had no immediate retort. Her mind scrambled for an excuse, someone else to blame. But deep down, a creeping realization settled in. This disaster was her doing. Before she could react, a bridesmaid peeked in nervously. Isabella?" People are waiting for a bride with no dress. Isabella's heart pounded. She had been so focused on her rage that she hadn't thought of the guests, the ceremony, the fact that she was standing here, half-dressed, while everyone outside whispered about her. And then, the final blow came. From the doorway, her fiancé's voice rang out, cold and sharp. Maybe this is a sign. Isabella turned slowly, dread sinking into her stomach. Her groom stood there, staring at her with an unreadable expression. And his next words would change everything. The room fell into dead silence. Isabella's breath hitched as she locked eyes with her fiancé, Daniel Whitmore. Tall, composed, and always measured in his words, Daniel had never raised his voice at her before. But the way he looked at her now sent a cold shiver down her spine. "A sign?" she repeated, forcing a laugh. "Daniel, what are you talking about?" He stepped further inside, his gaze flickering to the destroyed gown before settling back on her. "This," he said, gesturing vaguely. "All of it. The dress, the disaster outside, the way you're handling this." His voice was eerily calm, but there was something final in his tone. Isabella's hands clenched into fists. "Are you seriously blaming me for this? My dress fell apart on my wedding day, and instead of supporting me, you're acting like this is my fault." Daniel exhaled slowly. "It is your fault, Isabella." Her face twisted with anger. "Excuse me?" He shook his head, looking exhausted rather than angry. "The way you treat people, the way you demand perfection but refuse to listen to reason, it all caught up to you." His eyes flicked toward Manuela, who stood quietly in the background. "And I have no doubt that this woman did exactly what she was paid to do. The problem wasn't the dress, it was you." Isabella's mouth fell open. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice sharp. "Daniel, this is absurd. You don't want to start a marriage by humiliating your bride." He let out a bitter chuckle. "That's exactly why I'm not starting this marriage at all." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Isabella staggered back. "What?" "I can't do this," Daniel said firmly. "I've ignored the signs for too long. The way you talked to people, the way you treated Manuela, your bridesmaids, the wedding staff, it's all been a huge red flag," he exhaled. "And I don't want to spend my life with someone who thinks kindness is beneath her." Isabella shook her head rapidly, her perfectly planned life slipping through her fingers. "You can't just walk away, the guests are waiting, this is our wedding day." Daniel's expression didn't change. "No, Isabella, this was a mistake." Evelyn gasped. The bridesmaids looked anywhere but at Isabella. Manuela remained still, her face unreadable. And then, with the entire wedding hanging in the balance, Daniel turned and walked out of the room. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the hall. And with them, Isabella's perfect world came crashing down. The moment Daniel disappeared down the hall, Isabella felt her world spin. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. Her wedding, her perfect, grand, flawless wedding, was falling apart right before her eyes. First the dress, now the groom. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. She turned to her mother in desperation. "Do something." But for the first time, Evelyn Montgomery had no answer. She simply stared at her daughter, a look of disappointment flickering in her usually composed expression. "He's made up his mind, Isabella." Tears of frustration burned in Isabella's eyes. "I'll talk to him," she insisted. "I'll fix this." But deep down, she knew. There was no fixing this. The weight of everything hit her all at once. The way she had treated Manuela, the way she had ignored every warning about her dress, the way she had spoken down to everyone as if they were beneath her. She had spent so much time making sure everything looked perfect on the outside that she never stopped to think about the way she acted. And now, it had cost her everything. Her bridesmaids stood awkwardly to the side, avoiding eye contact. No one rushed to comfort her. No one defended her, because they had seen it too. Slowly, Isabella turned toward Manuela, the woman she had belittled and insulted, the woman she had blamed for her own mistakes. Manuela met her gaze, her expression unreadable. She wasn't gloating, she wasn't smug. She was simply there, standing tall, knowing she had done nothing wrong. For the first time in a long time, Isabella felt something unfamiliar. Shame. She swallowed hard. The words felt foreign in her mouth, but she forced them out anyway. "I'm sorry." A pause, then a small nod from Manuela. "Nothing more." But that was enough. With a deep breath, Isabella turned toward the window, where the guests were still waiting, still murmuring, still wondering why the ceremony hadn't begun. And for the first time in her life, Isabella Montgomery had to face the consequences of her own actions. Because this wasn't just a ruined dress. This was the moment she realized that sometimes, the worst disasters aren't accidents. They're the results of the choices we make. If you enjoyed this story and love dramatic twists, karma moments, and life lessons, don't forget to like this video. Your support helps us create more amazing stories, just like this one. What did you think about Isabella's downfall? Comment below and share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you don't want to miss more gripping stories with shocking endings, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Lastly, share this story with your friends and family. It might just teach someone an important lesson. Thanks for watching.